Estamos en la sesión final de la conferencia y estamos con dos pesos pesados, porque aunque Holm se ría, Stefan no, porque no me entiende, Holm Kohler llegó aquí en el año 93 con un proyecto sobre declive industrial y aquí sigue como una de las personas que mejor nos conocen, ¿no? Llegó a estudiar a los aborígenes y se quedó a vivir con ellos. Como una de las voces que lleva desde hace muchos años expresando una visión crítica sobre el rumbo que las cosas tomaban en Asturias y haciendo propuestas. Y un poco en virtud de eso fue reclutado para esta sesión de clausura del Congreso para expresar unas cuantas ideas generales y después, si acaso, dar paso a Stefan Berger, que dirige el Instituto de Movimientos Sociales de Bochum y que trabaja sobre temas de desindustrialización, una perspectiva comparada desde hace muchos años. Holm, cuando quieras.
Bueno, ¿me escucháis bien? ¿Sí?
Perfectamente.
Pues nada, muy bien. Muchas gracias por la invitación y por el honor de introducir a Stefan y esta sesión final de estas magníficas jornadas que yo solo me he podido contactar en un par de ocasiones porque ando muy liado con otras cosas mucho menos agradables que esto, estas semanas. Y claro, esto también me pilla un poco contrapié porque, claro, yo contaba con presentar a Stefan, pero contaba en persona, que otra vez más, porque ya tuve el honor de hacerlo en otras ocasiones. Y después pensaba, bueno, por lo menos él iba a intervenir de forma telemática, pero yo por lo menos voy a tener algún público presente. Y digamos, muy al final, el virus se cargó con todo esto. Y me encuentro en esta situación y con prácticamente nada realmente preparado, que ya me pidieron, pues ya que estás, que también pues contribuyas un poco. Entonces, realmente lo que de forma un poco breve e introductoria quería contribuir es un poco recuerdos míos que ha pasado en estos 30 años que llevo aquí en Asturias en términos de cómo la población asturiana pues afronta este proceso de desindustrialización que nos ha sostenido. Y tenía en principio, claro, previsto simplemente hablar un poco, unas impresiones, pero ya en esta situación, pues muy sobre la marcha, es decir, ayer tuve un hueco, entonces puse por lo menos un breve PowerPoint que no está lejos de del nivel que he visto estos días y a ver si soy capaz de hacerlo visible para vosotros, porque yo con estas tecnologías me siento muy torpe, pero parece que está cargando. ¿Podéis ver?
Lo vemos, ya se ve.
Sí, perfectamente, Holm.
Vale. Pues nada, a ver si se puede. Sí. Pues nada, estos son unas pocas puntos que voy a más bien recordar sobre cómo se ha vivido este proceso aquí en esta región. Y lo puse en inglés rápidamente sobre la marcha traducido, sobre todo para Stefan y para quizá alguno más que tiene dificultades con el castellano. Primero, unos datos para recordar la dimensión. simplemente para recordar la dimensión. Es decir, el gran, digamos, pico del liderazgo industrial de Asturias en España fueron los años 50, cuando pues 143.000 personas trabajaban en la industria en Asturias. Y a mitad de los años 80, cuando empezó todo el proceso de la mal denominada reconversión, pues todavía 100.000 personas trabajaban en la industria en esta región y todavía no se percibía digamos, algo como un proceso de desindustrialización. Todavía en los grandes buques de industria asturiana, en la empresa minera de Onosa y en la de siderurgia de Ensidesa, trabajaban más de 20.000 personas. Una década más tarde, a la década que me voy a referir ahora, todavía trabajaban 67.000 personas en la industria, de los cuales 25.000 trabajaban en empresas del Instituto Nacional de Industria, es decir, eran públicos, en empresas públicas, aunque en Ensidesa ya había empezado el proceso de privatización, por eso ya no se llama Ensidesa, sino Corporación Siderúrgica Integral, en proceso de buscar comprador, para decirlo así. Y podéis ver que en esa década, de 85 a 95, pues las plantillas de Onosa y Ensidesa se habían reducido a la mitad. Y pues hoy en día, pues quedan unos 55.000 personas trabajando en la industria, que representan unos 18% de la población ocupada, que es un poco más que el resto de España, que anda por 13-14%, pero ya estamos en una economía muy terciarizada, donde 300.000 personas trabajan en el sector servicios. Y en ArcelorMittal, la antigua Ensidesa, quedan cerca de 5.000 empleados, amenazados por varios procesos de reducción de cierres de tal, porque ahora mismo forma parte del mayor grupo siderúrgico del mundo, dentro del cual pues es una pequeña pieza. Y esto es algo duro de aceptar para una gente que está acostumbrado a ser la empresa con diferencia más importante. Y ahora es dentro del grupo de ArcelorMittal, pues es pues nada en términos de peso y de tal. Y en Onosa pues ya ni llega a 1.000 empleados y prácticamente las minas pues habían sido cerrados. Entonces, ¿cómo se ha vivido esto en los años 90 cuando yo llegué a esta región? Pues fue una situación bastante dramática para la población asturiana, porque tuvieron que darse cuenta que este proceso de desindustrialización es un proceso aparentemente irreversible. Hasta entonces había dominado una actitud de defensa de la industria, y la industria era válida, digamos, creaba valor. En Asturias se había vivido la transición democrática de los años 70-80 con una idea de que ahora íbamos a llegar a tiempos buenos, digamos, no de un socialismo, pero por lo menos de una economía social protegida, con buen empleo industrial, protegida por la por el sector público, protagonizado por el sector público, y políticamente acompañado por unos gobiernos socialistas, digamos. Y desde mediados de los años 80, directamente con los gobiernos socialistas en el poder, sobre todo en Madrid y también en Asturias, pues se dieron cuenta que no, pues esto no iba a ser una economía social, industrial, pública, sino una economía que se iba a incorporar de forma muy dramática y dura en una economía capitalista internacional privatizada, digamos, de las reglas de la competitividad industrial de una economía de mercado. Entonces, el proceso de desindustrialización o de declive industrial adoptó una crisis severa. O sea, no fue ya percibido como un proceso de reestructuración o de reconversión o de transición o algo, no, una crisis severa. Y esta imagen que se estableció, esto de finales de los 80, principios de los 90, pues realmente dura hasta nuestros días. Asturias vive en una crisis severa industrial, pues de más de 30 años ya. Lo que también es llamativo, que sobre todo en los años 90 todavía, cuando por ejemplo económicamente y socialmente el peso de la siderurgia, de Ensidesa y después de Acerrabia y tal, era mucho más importante en términos de peso económico y de empleo inducido, etcétera, del impacto sobre el conjunto de la economía regional, pues en el discurso público hubo un claro dominio del carbón. Es decir, Asturias iba del oro negro al futuro negro, digamos. Esto era la imagen, ¿no? Y esto que había no solamente la siderurgia, había los astilleros, había el cierre de empresas del textil, etcétera, no solamente con cierres y pérdidas de empleo, sino también con movilizaciones muy importantes. Pero en general dominaba el carbón como el sector, pues, de imagen dominante, que fue, desde mi punto de vista, una imagen distorsionado y problemático, porque provocó una actitud hacia el declive industrial de tratar a todos los sectores con la misma idea de, pues, intentar, digamos, alargar y amortiguar el cierre y, pues, a cambio de prejubilaciones, como todos sabemos, allí fue el instrumento principal, y no luchar por una reconversión real, es decir, por un futuro renovado y modernizado de estas empresas y de estos sectores. Esto para el carbón, pues, tenía racionalidad. Es decir, el carbón asturiano no tenía futuro ya entonces, estaba claro para cualquier cabeza pensante sin ilusiones. Pero la siderurgia y los astilleros sí tenían futuro en una forma, pues esto sí, radicalmente modernizada, racionalizada, reestructurada y preparada para la competencia internacional. Pero claro, como a estos sectores y empresas se trataba de la misma manera, a todos igual, pues, y todos como el ejemplo del carbón, que era la excepción, que no era la regla, pues esto llevó o contribuyó a políticas muy equivocadas de gestión del declive. Y, claro, entró el tema de prejubilaciones con mucho impacto, no solamente sobre la población y sobre estos sectores y trabajadores afectados, sino sobre todo la cultura de las zonas industriales de la región. Pues voy a dejar de lado que también todo este tiempo vivía Asturias una despoblación de las zonas rurales y una reducción drástica de empleo y de la actividad en la Asturias agraria, ganadera y rural. Pero bueno, la industria en la imagen pública dominaba claramente y el carbón seguía dominando, y allí las prejubilaciones muy generosas pues se presentaron como el gran logro de las luchas mineras, y entonces se abrió una brecha entre la imagen de Asturias como una región industrial y la realidad de una región cada vez más envejecida y de poca población activa industrial. Y, por otro lado, pues empezaron los procesos de privatización de los otros sectores industriales. El carbón, desde luego, no era privatizable, ni siquiera con las cuantiosas subvenciones, pero los otros sectores o cerraron o se privatizaron. Solo aquí, por ejemplo, la famosa Marcha de Hierro del 1992 demostró la alta capacidad movilizadora de entonces de los trabajadores de siderurgia, una marcha de los siderúrgicos del País Vasco y de Asturias a Madrid para reclamar el futuro del sector siderúrgico en España. Y pues Naval Gijón vivía pues muchos años de movilizaciones y defendiendo con cierto éxito. O sea, esto fue en los años 80 y todavía en los años 90, y consiguieron por lo menos salvar esta empresa frente a la amenaza de cierre hasta finales de la década de la primera década de este siglo, hasta que definitivamente pues fue cerrada esta empresa. Pero había muchas movilizaciones en los otros sectores, pero en la imagen pública el dominio del carbón era evidente. Entonces, en los discursos de estos años, pues tengo aquí algunos digamos, componentes claves de esta percepción en estos años 90. Primero, se construyó Asturias como víctima de fuerzas externas, es decir, el Estado central, es decir, Madrid, y después, a partir de la adhesión a la Comunidad Económica Europea, también Bruselas, pues eran los responsables, los que abandonan Asturias, que dejan Asturias a su mala suerte, y se estableció un discurso así fatalista que contra esas fuerzas grandes externas no podemos defendernos, y nos han abandonado al cierre. Y esto combinado con una idea de una deuda histórica y moral. Es decir, Asturias había levantado al país después de la guerra civil, ¿no? cuando Asturias se convirtió en la gran reserva energética de toda España. Y ahora España, el resto de España, no tiene ningún tipo de gratitud frente a ese esfuerzo particular asturiano y tal, ¿no? Y se seguía defendiendo el carbón como un sector estratégico para garantizar el autoabastecimiento energético de la economía española. Algo totalmente absurdo desde un punto de vista económico racional. Es decir, si la economía española hubiera dependido otra vez más del carbón asturiano, pues se hubiera convertido en una economía totalmente desastrosa y tercermundista, vamos, es imposible. Pero esto seguía durante mucho tiempo la idea que tenemos que conservar este carbón, aunque está un poco, yo qué sé, un poco difícil, de baja calidad y muy caro y tal, pero para tener algo propio, una fuente de energía propio para nosotros. Y todo lo que era el pasado industrial fue glorificado de una manera, pues, esto sí aparece en casi todos los discursos. Es decir, aquí había una vida, unas actividades por todos lados, una vida social, unas fiestas, cines y teatros y bailes y lo que sea. Vamos, nadie hablaba del penoso, lo que era el trabajo y muchos aspectos de la vida en la España, digamos, de los años 50, 60. No, esto era todo glorificado enormemente. Entonces, claro, este era un discurso que dificultaba cualquier iniciativa de buscar alternativas reales, más allá de, digamos, de repartir fondos y de pagar prejubilaciones. Bueno, y ya, voy a citar dos documentos de esta época que, en mi opinión, representan muy bien cómo se percibía entonces. Había un gran proyecto de estrategias de reindustrialización de Asturias con enormes recursos y produciendo muchísimos documentos, bastante bien, algunos elaborados, con participación de muchos, sobre todo economistas de la región, y dirigido por un señor, Manuel Castells, entonces gran profesor de la Universidad de Berkeley en California, y actualmente ministro de Universidades del Gobierno de España. Y allí tienen un capítulo, digamos, un documento sobre esto, sobre las mentalidades y las percepciones, y ahí se lee estas frases. Dice: casi todos los discursos dan 3 pasos. Constatan la falta de alternativas, confiesan que no ven qué puede hacerse y que, en consecuencia, creen que no hay salida para los problemas actuales, y concluyen que Asturias es hoy una región sin futuro. Pues esto sí coincide en gran medida con las entrevistas que yo estaba realizando con mis colaboradores en estos años aquí en la región. Y luego hay un economista asturiano que entonces, en estos años, trabajaba mucho sobre temas de reconversión industrial y de crisis de la economía asturiana. Posteriormente fue rector de la Universidad de Oviedo, Juan Vázquez, que publicó en estos años en un artículo esta reflexión. Las mentalidades más extendidas parecen otorgar a la crisis un carácter irreversible y una raíz exógena. derivada del carácter dependiente de la economía asturiana de un Estado que habría abandonado a su suerte a una región castigada en el proceso de integración europea y que nos colocaría en posición acreedora y con una deuda moral aún por saldar ante el gobierno central. El pesimismo y la pasividad, la apreciación de la gravedad de la crisis y la acomodación personal a ella, la percepción de una situación crítica y una impotencia resignada, el negativismo y la crítica sin alternativas, la mezcla de insensibilidad e hipercriticismo parecen haberse impuesto en esas circunstancias como una particular idiosincrasia ante la crisis. Y la verdad que creo que es una cita bastante acertada de cómo se vivía entonces este proceso de desindustrialización. Pues nada, ya voy a terminar. ¿Qué ha pasado con este discurso, con estas percepciones, hasta hoy en día, digamos, 30 años más tarde? La verdad que esto de la idea de la crisis industrial irreversible y como un castigo de la región, pues sigue en pie, aunque de una forma ya muy poco dramática, sino más bien asumida. Pues es así. Y vivimos con esto y no podemos hacer nada con esto. El dominio del carbón sí ha cedido, porque ya no queda nada, ¿no? Entonces, el cierre de la mina muy duramente se ha asumido. Entonces, el carbón hoy en día es pasado. Y lo que sí se vive como problema industrial hoy en día son cierres continuos de plantas de tamaño medio, es decir, de plantas de multinacionales. Ya el INI también ha desaparecido, de plantas de multinacionales que tienen 200, 300, como mucho 400 empleados de este tamaño medio, como son aquí algunos ejemplos: Suzuki, Vesuvius, Alcoa, Tenneco, las centrales térmicas. Todo esto son plantas que están ya cerradas o en proceso de cierre, que representan el tejido industrial en Asturias, con pues la persistente experiencia de afrontar cierres decretados, digamos, desde centros de poder de decisión muy lejos de esta región, ¿no? de centros de gestión, empresas multinacionales que pues a veces ni saben. Es decir, yo cuando investigué el caso de una empresa de amortiguadores estadounidense, que la dirección no sabía ni dónde está Gijón, dónde está la planta todavía de esta empresa. Es decir, que no, que Asturias depende ya no de Madrid ni de Bruselas, sino de decisiones que se toman en centros de decisión totalmente alejados. La juventud pues ha aceptado de forma bastante generalizada que aquí no tiene futuro, que aquí recibe como mucho una buena educación primaria, secundaria, terciaria o de formación profesional, lo que sea, pero si tiene alguna ambición de desarrollar una carrera profesional con perspectivas, pues tiene que emigrar. La juventud ya no lucha por el futuro de Asturias, sino lucha de forma individual por su propio futuro, buscando salidas fuera de Asturias. Mientras los mayores pues han asumido el envejecimiento. Asturias es, junto con algunas regiones en el este de Alemania, la región en Europa más envejecida. Y asume que el pasado industrial se está convirtiendo y se ha convertido en pues, patrimonio industrial, digamos, en un paisaje museístico. Y pues tuve que aprender que las deudas morales e históricas nunca se cobran, nunca se pagan. Y entonces hay un ambiente, yo diría, de resignación y de asentarse de una forma más o menos tranquila, mientras pues, se mantiene mediante jubilaciones y subvenciones y tal, digamos, un nivel de vida digna, además con un papel importante de las familias y tal, que mantienen, por ejemplo, Asturias en una situación de relativamente estabilidad social, de poca pobreza, siempre comparando con el resto de España, y de una situación social todavía bastante aceptada, pero, repito, la industria es cada vez más algo que pertenece al pasado y no tiene un futuro por el cual se puede luchar. Pues esto, nada más, con esta brevedad, mis reflexiones un poco introductorias y mis recuerdos a digamos, a estas percepciones durante estos 30 años, cómo se ha vivido aquí en Asturias este proceso de desindustrialización. Y nada, os agradezco la atención hasta aquí. Y no sé si os parece o si queréis comentar algo, o voy directamente a la presentación de Stefan y a la pieza principal de esta sesión final de estas jornadas.
Holm, si no te importa, da
Sí.
paso a Stefan y luego ya abrimos el debate con vosotros dos conjuntamente.
Vale, perfecto. Entonces, bueno, sigo en castellano. Stefan me va a entender las pocas palabras que voy a decir de él, que desde luego yo creo que es un honor y una muy buena ocasión para nosotros de contar con la participación de Stefan, no la primera vez, en estas jornadas de patrimonio industrial. Stefan Berger es profesor de historia social de la Universidad de Bochum en Alemania, una universidad y una ciudad que tiene largas y buenas relaciones con Oviedo y con Asturias. Las universidades y las ciudades son hermandadas. Yo he venido a Asturias en su día a través de este instituto que Stefan está dirigiendo ahora, que es el Instituto de Movimientos Sociales. Stefan ha estudiado historia y ciencias políticas y se doctoró en la Universidad de Oxford, en Inglaterra, y después trabajó décadas en distintas universidades del Reino Unido, en la de Plymouth, en la de Manchester y sobre todo en la universidad, muchos años en la Universidad de Cardiff, de País de Gales. Y allí vivía muy de cerca todo el tema de reconversión industrial, del declive del carbón, y adquirió pues amplios conocimientos también comparativos sobre, digamos, los coal mining communities, es decir, las comunidades, las sociedades dominados por ese sector de carbón. Aunque sus obras quizá más conocidas e importantes han sido sobre procesos de formación de naciones, de nacionalismos y de identidades nacionales. Entonces tiene allí la historia comparada de nacionalismos e identidades nacionales, pero también las regiones industriales y particularmente mineras y el patrimonio industrial como unos ejes principales de su obra, de su trabajo. Y pues ya lleva pues muchos años dirigiendo este instituto de la Universidad de Bochum y colaborando con nosotros en este tipo de eventos y de investigaciones. Y pues nada, tenemos el placer de contar hoy otra vez más con una contribución suya aquí. Y si os parece, pues lo pongáis ahora.
My name is Stefan Berger. I'm professor of social history at the Ruhr-Universität in Bochum, where I also direct the Institute for Social Movements, which is a central research institute of the university, and I'm chair of the Foundation History of the Ruhr, which is a public-private partnership aiming at understanding better the history of this most important region of heavy industry in Germany. I'm also honorary professor at Cardiff University in the UK, and much of my recent work has been on processes of deindustrialization and industrial heritage making, and I'm particularly interested in putting these processes in a comparative framework. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting conference. Obviously, I would have loved to be there in person rather than record this lecture, but the current situation, unfortunately, doesn't allow me to travel, as the university here in Bochum does not give any travel allowances at the moment to its staff for any international travel. But hopefully this will be changed and we can see each other in person again before long. Anyway, what I was going to do in Asturias and what I'm going to do now from my home office is to talk a little bit about an attempt to put industrial heritage and its relationship to structural economic transformations, essentially deindustrialization, into a global context. It's not so much the outcome of a finished research project, but it is rather an attempt to think aloud about something that I think will be necessary to do in the future, i.e. to move deindustrialization studies and studies concerned with industrial heritage from a very local and regional context in which it was both subjects really, in which both subjects were born and where both subjects still are today, to more comparative and more trans-regional perspectives. In fact, what I'm going to say in the following is very much part and parcel of an ERC application that I have just submitted. And obviously, if successful, then I will have the possibility of putting this research project into practice over the next couple of years. What I would like to do this morning is basically, first of all, talk a little bit about deindustrialization and its consequences in global historical perspective. And then from there, move on to the development of industrial heritage, because those forms that we see of industrial heritage in different parts of the world are deeply interrelated to the various paths of deindustrialization that we find in different parts of the world. And essentially, I want to distinguish between different types of industrialization producing different types of industrial heritage. And I see the following types. First of all, the Anglo world. And here I will talk a little bit about the United States, Canada, Britain, and Australia. And then Continental Europe, where I will talk a little bit about Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. Then a different type, I think, of deindustrialization and ensuing industrial heritage, post-communist Eastern Europe. Another type, post-communist China. And from post-communist China, I will extend the view a little bit to the global south. And at the very end, I'm hoping to draw some very preliminary, very tentative conclusions about possible ways of constructing a practical past, obviously borrowing this phrase from Hayden White's last book, through industrial heritage. That's the program, and let's see how it goes. Now, if we start with deindustrialization and its consequences, then of course deindustrialization is often perceived as a phenomenon that takes place above all in the northern industrial half of the globe. But if we look a bit closer, we can of course observe that it is a truly global phenomenon, because even in the global south, which often benefits from deindustrialization in the global north, industries moving from the global north to the global south. But even within the global south, we have pockets of deindustrialization. So it is not at all a phenomenon that we can only find in the global north, despite the fact that even if we look at deindustrialization studies, the overwhelming majority of those studies are at the moment on the global north. Deindustrialization is interconnected with structural change, and yet, especially in the English language, I think structural change doesn't really sound right. There is something that is alien to the term structural change in English, whereas deindustrialization is the most common term used in the English language. And I think this has to do with the fact that structural change, in fact, is something that is very much associated to a process that perhaps in its clearest form has taken place in Germany. And in German, the term Strukturwandel, which literally translated means structural change, is something that is far more commonly used than deindustrialization. Now, why is that? I think it has to do with the fact that structural change, Strukturwandel in German, has positive connotations, whereas deindustrialization has negative connotations. And within the German term Strukturwandel, structural change, there is the idea that you can actually shape deindustrialization, that you can manage deindustrialization, that you can transition regions from deindustrialization to a positive economic, social, and cultural future. So we have already in the language, I think, two very different concepts of what is going on under conditions of deindustrialization. And that is also reflected, I think, in different pathways to industrialization and from industrializations. And I will talk a little bit more about that when I introduce the different types. Now, obviously, deindustrialization or structural change is an economic process. It has to do with economics. It has to do with the fact that certain industries are no longer profitable in the global north and they move to the global south, where the respective industries can produce their goods and products far more cheaply than they can in the global north. But deindustrialization is, of course, much more than an economic process. I think in order to understand deindustrialization, we need to look at the social fabric of the societies undergoing deindustrialization. We need to understand deindustrialization as a cultural process, what is happening with the identities of the people undergoing deindustrialization, how do particular cultures, working class cultures in particular, change under the impact of deindustrialization, and what political consequences are there relating to deindustrialization. We have seen in a number of countries a move towards right-wing populism in deindustrializing areas. So there clearly is a politics of deindustrialization which has often important implications and repercussions for the politics not only of the regions undergoing deindustrialization, but also for the nations at large. Now, I think we can also differentiate between the management of deindustrialization from above, so people who are in positions of power, either in government or in industry, and who attempt to shape deindustrialization in a variety of different ways from above. And at the same time, we have from below responses to deindustrialization from those most affected by deindustrialization, i.e. The workers who used to be working in those industries who are now no longer functioning, and social movements, urban social movements, but also labor unions, labor movements who are trying to protect their members from the effects of deindustrialization and are also in some way, shape or form trying to suggest policies in order to come to terms with the economic processes of deindustrialization. And I think we need to pay attention to the interactions between the management of deindustrialization from above and the responses to deindustrialization from below. In order to do that, I think we need to put into conversation deindustrialization studies with heritage studies, but also with memory studies, because a lot of the processes that are cultural processes in regions undergoing deindustrialization have to do with memory. So the memory both of the industrial past, but also the memory of deindustrialization itself has an important impact on the answers to deindustrialization, which is also one good reason, I think, why many deindustrialization studies and a good deal of also heritage studies have embarked on oral history projects in order to recover the memories of people undergoing deindustrialization. And I think we also need to bring into play social movement studies. So the idea that we look at those movements, be they urban social movements, be they labor movements, who were most directly confronted with the consequences of deindustrialization and who were often struggling to formulate answers to deindustrialization. Now, if we look at the development of industrial heritage and its relationship to path of deindustrialization, then we can see that the construction of industrial heritage or the refusal to construct industrial heritage both are strongly related to forms of memory politics. I've tried to put this into a kind of comparative perspective in a special issue of the journal Labor, which you see pictured here on deindustrial heritage that I co-edited with Stephen High in 2019. And I think we need to pay more attention to those processes that lead either to the construction or the denial of the construction of industrial heritage in particular places. Now, I've completely failed, I think, to address the pictures that I had in the other slide. So if I go back, pictured here is the largest steelworks in Europe today, which is in the Ruhr area of Germany, which has undergone massive deindustrialization over the last half century. But I put it here to show that, of course, deindustrialization processes are something that are usually not happening overnight, and that we also often have parallel processes of still industrialization and industrial companies being very important to particular regions and deindustrialization processes. And in the slide before that, I pictured a book I published this year in 2020, where I, for the first time, especially in the introduction and the conclusion, have tried to develop some of the ideas about global perspectives on deindustrialization that I'm also talking about today. Now, continuing with this question of the construction or non-construction of industrial heritage, I think if we see this as being related to forms of memory politics, then I would suggest it makes sense to put it into a theoretical framework of memory studies that has been discussed within memory studies over the last 4 or 5 years. And that distinguishes between different forms of memory regimes. And there are 3 memory regimes according to this theory of agonistic memory: antagonistic memory, cosmopolitan memory, and agonistic memory. And the question that we need to ask, I would argue, is what memory regime fits which pathway of deindustrialization, if we look at this in comparative perspective. Now, perhaps for those of you who are not familiar with this theory of agonistic memory, it really goes back to an article that was first published in Memory Studies in 2016 by my colleagues Hans-Lauger Hansen and Anna Cento-Bull, entitled On Agonistic Memory. And it sets out these 3 different regimes of remembering. The theory of agonistic memory has been deeply inspired by the work of the political theorist Chantal Mouffe, who has written on agonistic politics. And this is an attempt by Hansen and Bull to translate the ideas of Mouffe into the field of memory studies. Now, in a nutshell, what they are arguing is that you can differentiate between antagonistic, cosmopolitan, and agonistic memory frames. Antagonistic memory frames, they argue, are frames which distinguish clearly between a positive us and a negative them. It has a clear picture of heroes that belong to the us and of villains that belong to the them. It works very much through passions of identity, of identification with the us. It is extremely monologic. It is only oriented towards the us, and the them, the other, is only there as a negative force to reinforce the positive identity of the us. Classic forms of antagonistic memory we find in nationalism. So nationalist movements usually work through forms of antagonistic memory. But we also, of course, find them in communism, where you also have a very antagonistic memorial frame, usually the heroes being the working class and the villains being the capitalists. So we find them in a range of ideologies that were powerful in the 19th and 20th centuries. Cosmopolitan memory also works through binaries. It also works through identifying an us and a them. And usually the us is sort of those people who feel committed to liberal forms of humanitarianism, to a strong human rights discourse, which it juxtaposes to the totalitarianisms of the 20th century, fascism and communism, which is the negative them in theories of cosmopolitan memory. Very much works through identification with the suffering of the victims of totalitarianism. It's very much a victim-centered discourse. And it works through the passions of compassion with the victims. It is not monologic. It accepts that there is a certain perspectivity in memory, and it is self-reflexive. It reflects its own positionality within the kind of multiple positions that we can find in memory discourses. But ultimately, what cosmopolitan memory aims at, in the kind of model of political theory that is very much associated with the theory of deliberative democracy, associated with Jürgen Habermas and others, what it aims to is to, through dialogue, to arrive at consensus. The aim at the end is to arrive at consensus. And once cosmopolitan memory has arrived at consensus, there are those who are within the consensus and those who are without the consensus. And then the dialogue stops. Then the kind of only those who are inside that consensus can still be part of the dialogue. And then the third memory regime, agonistic memory, this would be a memory that is aiming at overcoming the binary setup of memory frames. Rather than thinking of an us and a them, it aims at radical historicization. So the idea that you are aiming at understanding through memory the different positions of actors in the past. And that does not only concern the victims of past conflicts, but it also concerns the perpetrators, and it also concerns the bystanders. So there is an attempt to be even more self-reflexive, and especially, and I think this is important, there is no attempt to arrive at consensus. Agonistic memory, thus Bull and Hansen, is open-endedly self-reflexive, and it is open-endedly discursive, very much taking their cue from the Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. Bull and Hansen argue that there is in agonistic memory the recognition that there are different politics, and that these different politics are based on irreconcilably different interests. And it is a matter of the political process to decide which of these memory regimes ultimately will have the upper hand. Therefore, theories of agonistic memory are also attempting to repoliticize memory, arguing that cosmopolitan memory, through its attempt to find consensus, has in fact depoliticized memory. So it is an attempt to repoliticize memory and to give voice to those who in cosmopolitan memory have been left without a voice because they are standing outside of the consensus. The theories of agonistic memory work through the passions of solidarity, which also shows that the proponents of agonistic memory find themselves politically very much on the left. And that they are trying, just like in a way Muff has been trying with her agonistic politics, to give a voice to a left that has been left speechless, according to Muff, by the neoliberal consensus that included much of social democracy in the 1990s and 2000s. So the theory of agonistic memory is also trying to reinforce the memory politics of a left. Now, I talked about this in quite some length because I think in my framework of comparing different pathways of deindustrialization and accompanying pathways of industrial heritageization, this theory of memory has an important part to play in understanding what has actually been going on, and how we construct those comparisons. because taking our cue from theories of agonistic memory, we can ask which actors tell which narratives in order to promote which memory politics in processes of deindustrialization. And I think what is very helpful here is also the various ideas surrounding critical heritage studies. Critical heritage studies very much taking their cue from Laura Jane Smith's book, I think of 2004, on critical heritage, which since then hasn't tired really to draw attention to the power imbalances that are always visible in the making of any type of heritage, including industrial heritage. Now, if we move now to our different types of deindustrialization and different types of industrial heritage making, and we start with the Anglo world, then we can see that deindustrialization here took place under conditions of market radicalism and neoliberalism. The Rust Belt of the United States has become the most iconic instance of what in the literature is often referred to as ruin porn. It has left landscapes of desolation. It has left cities that have become ghost cities almost. Detroit, I guess, is the most iconic city in that respect. And the idea here was that the market, you just have to leave the market alone. If companies go bust, they go bust. People will have to move elsewhere or find jobs elsewhere. And you just need to leave the market on its own, and then you will have an economy that finds its own way out of the crisis. A deep belief in market forces that is behind a lot of neoliberal ideas. We have also the strength of those neoliberal ideas elsewhere, but for example, in the country neighboring the United States, in Canada, we do find quite a different story. And of course, Stephen High, in his magnificent comparison of deindustrialization in Canada and in the United States, has pointed out that what was different in Canada was that here, actors from below, working class movements, urban movements, have been able to link their own strategies related to deindustrialization with forms of a kind of left-wing nationalism. And that meant that it gave them a resource in order to allow them to at least have a limited impact on strategies of deindustrialization and also on policies of heritageization. So in that respect, Canada has been quite different from the United States. Much closer to the United States, I would argue, was the situation in Britain, where I think we have seen in the 1980s something resembling and has been described as a class war from above. The picture here is a very famous, iconic picture from the miners' strike in Britain, Orgreaves, where you had a big demonstration of the miners, which was very violently ended by the police. And you see here the police brutality and violence against unarmed strikers that has become such a powerful symbol of Orgreaves and of the strike as such, because the state unleashed the full force of its powers against the miners' union to break the miners. And this was to be an example for the rest that the unions in Britain, once the most powerful unions in the world, that they had to be broken in order to allow that market radicalism and the neoliberalism associated with the governments of Margaret Thatcher to pursue their own pathway of deindustrialization. And the result, of course, was also that we find very little effort to have any kind of industrial heritage from above. that despite the fact that Britain, of course, is the first country to develop ideas of industrial heritage already in the 1950s. Iron Bridge is perhaps the best example for an early attempt. I think it was the first industrial heritage site that made it on the UNESCO World Heritage List. And the idea, of course, in the 1950s was very much that Britain celebrates its position as first workshop of the world. So again, deindustrialization, the memory of industrialization, the memory of industrial heritage was connected to nationalism in a way, because Britain was supposedly the motherland of the Industrial Revolution. It was here that it all happened first. And the early attempts at industrial heritage were an attempt to provide a certain pride to those regions that were at the heart of deindustrialization. All of that, I would argue, changed in the 1980s, where you had deindustrialization under conditions of market radicalism. And if we look at a place like South Wales, where you had in the South Wales coalfield a strong working class culture around the mining industries in the South Wales coalfield. After the miners' strike, most of those coal mines were closed within a year of the end of the miners' strike, and there were literally no attempt from above to preserve any of the industrial heritage of the region, basically because the government did not want a memory which could also be a memory of the bitter conflicts surrounding the end of the coal industry in Britain. And the only efforts that we have until today are efforts from below, are very much efforts from within the mining community, from within the local councils that were often Labour run. So we see, for example, the Rhondda Heritage Park in South Wales, which was created by mixture of former miners and intellectuals, academics, Labour politicians, the Labour MP Howell Francis, the historian of the South Wales coalfield, Di Smith. They were very influential in setting up this industrial heritage site. And the other site, Big Pit, which is also today a UNESCO World Heritage Site, started off by the council, which was Labour run, buying the land around the mine, and slowly and with very modest financial support developing the site as a memorial site to the mining communities of South Wales. Now we see very similar pictures in other parts of Britain. If we look at Northern England, the Midlands, I would argue a very similar picture. Australia is also a very interesting case because like in Britain, Australia had a very strong labor movement. Australia was, in global perspective, one of the earliest pioneers of the welfare state in the late 19th and early 20th century. But we also see in Australia in the 80s and 90s the strength of this neoliberalization, not only affecting the right, although it comes from the right, but also affecting the social democratic left. And what is added in Australia, I think, are the peculiarities of Australian industrialization, which until this very day is heavily dependent on extractive industries, iron ore, coal, and these extractive industries, you can find them in this vast country in rural areas. Which causes problems of memorialization because there is basically these communities, they dig huge holes in the middle of nowhere, get out the coal or the iron ore or whatever, and then they disappear. So there's a very different kind of industrial setup than we find in North America or, for that matter, in Europe. And within the cities, which of course also had industries, and within the big cities, we have the problems that they are booming. If we look at Sydney, if we look at Melbourne, and here it has been very difficult to establish sites of industrial heritage in the face of property developers and the enormous pressures of the market in constructing something that was hugely profitable. So that's another, I think, phenomenon that we also need to keep in mind when discussing heritagization in comparative perspective. So when we look at this, then we see in all of those cases, of course, strong attempts to build industrial heritage from below. And most of those attempts to build industrial heritage from below follow a very antagonistic memory frame. They are very much an oppositional force to governments, to employers who were seen as the villains in the story of deindustrialization. And they maintain a kind of narrative of opposition, which works very much with the passions of us, which is the former miners, and those who carry the legacy of the former miners, and them. I think it is very, very clear if we look at the exhibition that we find in the Big Pit site in South Wales, because at the end of that exhibition, which is about the world of miners and the world of mining, at the end of that exhibition, we find a huge list of all the, and I think there were over 100 mines in South Wales that were once open. And below that, in huge letters, there is the sentence, "We will be back." And of course, everyone knows that they won't be back. But it is this message of defiance and the message of opposition that characterizes, I think, the industrial heritage attempts from below in places where we see forces of market radicalism pushing through deindustrialization and providing often an atmosphere of class war from above. Now, if we look at continental Europe, we find a very different story. And I think this has to do with the fact that we have much stronger corporatist traditions in continental Europe, both liberal corporatism connected to democratic frameworks and illiberal corporatism connected to right-wing authoritarian or fascist regimes. And I think the strength of corporatism in Europe, in continental Europe, means that we also find more managed pathways to deindustrialization. We have a much stronger role of employers and unions collaborating with the state in finding pathways of deindustrialization that allow also the memory of the industrial past and the memory of deindustrialization to be represented at sites of industrial heritage. It's very much a regional process, which is, I think, also why we need to pay attention to forms of what goes on in the regions. And again, I've pictured here a volume I did with two of my colleagues here in Bochum on industrial heritage and regional identities. The best example, I think, is that of Rhinish capitalism in Germany, which ultimately led to the production what can be described as a kind of world superpower in industrial heritage in the Ruhr. And here, the memory frame, I would argue, is very much one of cosmopolitan memory. It's very much a memory frame that stresses that deindustrialization had the potential of producing many victims, and that it was only through the concerted effort of the partners in corporatism, of employers, unions, and the state, that these victims were given the opportunity to come through deindustrialization relatively unharmed. So that we have the proud story of an industrial region that was very important in the case of the Ruhr for the industrialization of Germany, associated with a very proud story of deindustrialization, where through various schemes, early retirement, retraining, the idea is that you avoided mass unemployment, you avoided mass dislocation of people, and you provided for a transition of a region that was once almost completely dependent on coal and steel to a region which has a much more diversified structure, economic structure, but a structure that still provides positive future scenarios for the people who live in that region. And we find similar processes of corporatism in other parts of continental Europe as well, perhaps to a very different degree, also depending on the success and failure of those economic transition processes. But French statism and the heritagization from above is very much visible in regions of heavy industry that had undergone deindustrialization in places like the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, in the industrial triangle in Italy between Genoa, Milan, and Turin. We can also see that in particular local councils often searched for ways of not only helping the economic transitioning, but also protecting to some degree the industrial heritage of the region. Although the industrial triangle works much less as a region, it really has a much weaker identity as a region as, say, the Ruhr region in Germany, because of the particular setup of regional identity in northern Italy, which is much more centered on cities, on urban spaces, than on regions. And we have, of course, in Spain, the case of Asturias, where this conference takes place, where we also have traditions of corporatism. Again, a case pretty much like in Germany, an interesting case where you have very illiberal forms of corporatism moving to more liberal forms of corporatism, and an attempt at heritagization that is much less pronounced than it is, say, in the Ruhr. Partly, of course, because in the case of Asturias, you also have other forms of heritage that are competing with the industrial heritage. I'm thinking of the medieval heritage that is very strong, and also the natural heritage. I mean, places like the Ruhr in some respects benefit from the fact that they have nothing else to fall back on, because there was nothing else, almost nothing else, before industrialization. Now, I've already referred at the beginning to the politics of deindustrialization and the rise of right-wing populisms, which we find not only in the United States, if we're thinking of Donald Trump, or in Britain, if we're thinking of Brexit, but also in Germany, in France, in Italy, the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, the Rassemblement National in France, the Northern League in Italy. And the interesting case here, I think, is that usually the politics of deindustrialization produces a deep disillusionment with the political establishment, and therefore we see a rise of right-wing populism. But in Asturias, we have the interesting case where we have a pretty strong left-wing populism. And the question, I think, that needs answering: why do we have this left-wing populism in Asturias? What was it in the pathway of deindustrialization that has led to the strength of the emergence of left-wing populism in Asturias? And I'm sure there are many people at the conference who can give me, can attempt to give me an answer to this one, because they know a lot more about Asturias than I do. Now, I think I have to speed up a little bit time-wise. So talking about post-communist Eastern Europe, I think a very different timeline of deindustrialization when compared to capitalist Western Europe, because essentially deindustrialization in Eastern Europe only happened after the demise of communism. It was artificially protected, the industries of Eastern Europe, by the communist world, which functioned also economically as a completely independent world. Well, not completely independent. Of course, there were entanglements also with the capitalist world. But it was only after the fall of communism and under the influence of market radicalism, which was very strong, especially in the early years of the 1990s in those post-communist Eastern European countries, that we see a massive decline of traditional industries, and it's really a situation perhaps comparable to the Rust Belt in the United States, because the dilemma for the industrial workers, sorry, the dilemma for the industrial workers was they had no one to defend themselves anymore, because the workers, as pictured here in a famous iconic image from the Soviet Union, they were the heroes of the communist state. The worker, the hammer, the woman with the sickle, the proletarians, they were marching into the bright future of communism. And after the demise of communism, industrial workers were still associated with communism, and therefore the post-communist politics had very few people who were still willing to defend workers. It's a little bit different in countries like Poland, because we have in Solidarność here a working class movement that was an oppositional movement to the communist state, and ultimately the key force in bringing down that state in the late 1980s. And that is also visible, I think, in the way that Poland has dealt with its industrial heritage. If we go to a place like Katowice in Upper Silesia, where we have seen considerable attempts also from above to preserve and memorialize that industrial heritage. But otherwise, I think we find in much of post-communist Eastern Europe also strong antagonistic memories of industrial heritage, or rather memory discourses that struggle to find any agents that will support those memory discourses of an industrial past, and deindustrialization processes that leave landscapes of desolation with very few attempts to come to forms of industrial heritage. Very briefly, post-communist China, which I think is a fascinating case study, because here we see massive industrialization after 1979, the reforms introduced by Deng Xiaoping. But we also, of course, have seen since then massive pockets of deindustrialization, often forgotten when talking about Chinese economic development in the West, and in particular the established state sector has undergone a prolonged crisis. If we look at the northeast of China, for example, where the heavy industry was particularly strong, was built up initially with Soviet help at the end of the Second World War, rather after 1949, after the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And here we see a crisis of industries, and we see deindustrialization. And we've also seen some attempts to move towards industrial heritage, although they have been very, very limited. The discourse in China has been far more about replacing failing industries with successful industries. But where there have been attempts at heritageization, this picture here is a relatively new industrial museum in Shenyang, which was a center of the coal industry in China, in the northeast of China. We see that the Chinese communist state has particular problems with industrial heritage. And what are those problems? Well, first of all, they are problems of the memories of colonialism. Because if we look at the industrialization of China, we see that industrialization in China in the beginnings has been pushed by colonial forces. It has been pushed by the Russians, especially in the northeast, and then later by the Japanese. So industrialization is not the foundational stone of a proud national memory, as, for example, it was in Britain in the 1950s, but it also always has this kind of colonial legacy, and therefore the memory needs to come to terms with that colonialism. What the communist regime in China has done, it has tried to erase the memories of colonialism rather than picking them up and dealing with them, and instead almost exclusively focusing on communist achievements of the past. And the Communist Party in the memorialization processes of industrialization is absolutely paramount, an attempt to create, if you like, long-term legacies of the Communist Party being the ones who successfully shape the Chinese path to communism, as it is often called today. So we have here an example of a strong heritageization from above. And interestingly, one result of that is the almost complete absence of the everyday in memorializations of industrialization in China. It is all about economic achievements, achievements of communist officials and functionaries, but ordinary workers, for example, hardly feature at all. So the question here, industrial heritage for whom, which is an important question in particular for critical heritage studies, it is clearly for the Communist Party, for legitimating the Communist Party, for legitimating the ruling dictatorship in China. Now, moving from there to the global south, we can see, I mean, the way that deindustrialization is often depicted is that there is a mirror process. We have deindustrialization in the global north and industrialization in the global south. But of course, we also have massive pockets of deindustrialization across the global south. If we think of Mumbai and Ahmedabad in India, if we think of Joburg in South Africa, Sao Paulo in Brazil, Buenos Aires in Argentina, the Zambian copper belt, all of these are areas where we saw massive industrialization, followed by, at least in certain areas, in certain sectors of industry, deindustrialization. And the study of deindustrialization here, I would argue, is an urgent need in order to understand better how global processes of deindustrialization and global processes of heritage making in industrial heritage are working. Again, like with China, we have a similar problem for the industrial heritage in the global south, that it in a way was always partly influenced by the global north. It always came second. It never was first. In a very different context, the post-colonial scholar Dipesh Chakrabarty has argued that post-colonial states find themselves in what he called the waiting room of history, never quite being allowed into the main room because they were always in that catching up position with the global north, who had always already been there when the global south arrived. And we find a similar kind of phenomenon when we look at industrial heritage and justifications for industrial heritage, because everything that we have in the global south was already there in the global north before them. Still, if we look a bit more closely, and I think here in particular of the work of Marion Steiner, who has worked a lot on Chile and the industrial relationships between Chile and Germany, there has been a global interchange, both in terms of industrialization and also in terms of industrial heritage production between the global north and the global south. And it would be interesting here to look more closely also at the role of institutions, organizations, where both the global north and the global south are represented. I'm thinking in particular of TICI here, but also we could also think of the Association of Critical Heritage Studies. But TICI, obviously, as an association for industrial heritage with a global reach, we have a lot of these interchanges going on here. And as I said before, I think it will be vital over the coming years to bring the global south more into discussions of deindustrializations if we want to really truly understand how deindustrialization has been going on in a global frame. Now, finally, conclusions. Can we construct something resembling what Hayden White has called a practical past through industrial heritage, and for whom would that practical past be? Now, I think that agonistic memory is crucial here, because agonistic memory has the power to counter a memory politics from above, an antagonistic memory politics from above that simply wants to erase industrial memory, or a memory politics from above that argues for compassion with the victims, but is still very self-celebratory, as we find it, for example, in the industrial heritage of the Ruhr region in Germany, celebrating the elites for allegedly doing so brilliantly in transitioning from deindustrialization to a post-industrial society. So agonistic memory will, in my view, be very important in empowering, in particular, urban social movements and the people in those regions of deindustrialization, the people most affected by deindustrializations. Comparing pathways of deindustrialization and comparing the narratives of heritagization that have accompanied those pathways of deindustrialization are, I think, an important contribution to forms of agonistic memory, and they are also a way of politicizing the memory struggles that have been and are still going on in those regions of deindustrialization. I think they will play a key role in delegitimizing market radicalism by showing clearly the landscapes of ruination and the disastrous balance sheet that has been left by market radicalism in terms of answers to deindustrialization. And I think agonistic memory will also be in a unique position to ask, if we manage deindustrialization in the mold of the continental European states, for whom do we manage it? Who are actually the beneficiaries of that management of deindustrialization? Is it the kind of new middle classes that we often find emerging in those deindustrializing areas? And I can see a certain correlation between the support for industrial heritage and the new middle classes, who are often most enthusiastic about industrial heritage, and this kind of particular management from above. I think what we need to aim for is a scholarship and a memory politics of industrial heritage, and I very much see scholarship as part and parcel of that memory politics that enables the agency of the people in those regions, that enables social movements speaking for those people in the processes of deindustrialization. And therefore, I think agonistic memory and using agonistic memory in studies of deindustrialization and industrial heritage will also allow us to understand industrial heritage as part and parcel of an ongoing political struggle. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Stefan, for your always inspiring and interesting talks. And pues mi sugerencia para el coloquio ahora es que los que son capaces de dirigir los comentarios, preguntas directamente en inglés a Stefan, que lo hagan, y yo después intento resumir en castellano la respuesta, y solo los que no se sienten capaces de hablar en inglés, poner en inglés sus preguntas, pues que lo hagan en castellano y yo voy a traducirlas. Pero yo intento hacer la comunicación lo más, digamos, lo menos pesado posible. Pues nada, está abierto el campo para poner preguntas y comentarios. ¿Quién levanta la mano? Que nadie se atreve. So, Stefan, you are there?
Yes, I'm here.
You hear me? Yes.
Yes.
So I will start with the question to the aspect of antagonistic memory. Let's say countering the memory constructions from above. So who do you think is or can be, let's say, the collective actor to form a social movement, to let's say, to demand, let's say, a critical counter memory policy in, let's say, particularly in European industrial or old industrial regions?
Thank you, Holm. Yeah, it's a difficult question because I think as we have seen over the recent decades and the struggles to do with deindustrialization, the collective actor is changing, sometimes from conflict to conflict. It is reconstituting itself in different ways, shapes, and forms. So it is, in some respects, inherently unstable. This instability is a weakness. It is, but it is also, in particular situation, a strength because it can recruit flexibly from different urban social movements, which can come together to unite in struggles, say, against gentrification or against the closure of particular plants. Where we still do have strong labor movements, these can also play a role in those struggles. But I think here we have to, and I think both Asturias, from the little I understand about Asturias, and also the Ruhr are good examples of that, because the corporatist structures in both Asturias and in the Ruhr mean that at times established labor movements are, if you like, implicit in strategies of deindustrialization, which in some respects benefit workers, but are also in conflict with some of the social movement activists that we find in those regions. So I think it's a very complicated, a very messy picture, because we are certainly far removed from having one collective actor, say the proletariat, that the socialists and the communists used to believe in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Thank you. Pues nada, le pregunté a Stefan sobre un posible actor colectivo para formar un movimiento, un posible movimiento en contra de las políticas de memoria desde arriba. Y Stefan contesta que es una situación complicada, porque hay una gran inestabilidad entre los movimientos sociales actuales. No hay un actor colectivo, un movimiento social fuerte, sino a veces estos actores colectivos cambian de conflicto en conflicto. Pero esta inestabilidad también puede ser una ventaja en muchas situaciones. También añade, pensando en Asturias, pero también en la cuenca del Ruhr, que no solo nuevos movimientos sociales o urbanos o civiles, sino también en muchas situaciones todavía, digamos, restos del movimiento obrero pueden jugar un papel importante digamos, en este contexto de gran inestabilidad y complejidad. Pues nada, tengo una mano pedida, me parece, o ya ha aparecido.
Sí, era Luisa Barbosa.
De Luisa, sí. Luisa, adelante.
Luisa, el micro.
Luisa, tienes el micro cerrado.
Yeah.
Ahora.
Now can you hear me? I have a problem with my micro. Always when I'm talking about populism. Can you see that? There is some problem here. Well, yeah, thank you both for the explanation. And my question is for both of you, and it's really similar with the question that I did in our last section. And it's about the increase of populism in our world nowadays. And I would like to know if you both see some connection between desindustrialization and the increase of populism.
Thank you. Holm, do you want to start or?
Holm, tienes el micro cerrado.
Oh, Stefan, start you if you don't mind.
Okay. Well,
maybe I will.
yeah. I mean, I see a very clear relationship between the increase in populism and deindustrialization, because I think wherever we look, we can see the appeal of populism in regions where deindustrialization is at work. If I give the example of the Ruhr, the area where I am in at the moment, we have here in the Ruhr, especially in the northern parts of the Ruhr, which are the ones that are most devastated by deindustrialization, which are the poorest areas, the areas with the greatest social problems. We have very strong election results for the right-wing populist party, the AfD. In the last regional elections in 2017, well over 15% in some of the northern parts of the Ruhr, which was the best result for the party in the former West German territories of the Federal Republic. I've referred to Brexit, Trumpism, the Rassemblement National in France. We see a lot of that. And I mean, as I mentioned in my paper, and this is probably a good moment to hand over to Holm, the interesting phenomenon for me is that in a place like Asturias, we seem to have rather left-wing populism than right-wing populism. And the question is, why do we get left-wing populism here? Is it simply because you do have that strong left-wing tradition in Asturias, going all the way back to the 1934 revolution, but maybe also the strength of the Communist Party in the more recent past, or the Socialist Party, and then of course the strength of Podemos, or it seems to me, in European perspective, Asturias is a little bit of an exception here, that we have not seen the rise of right-wing populism in an area undergoing, as Holm underlined in his talk, very heavy forms of deindustrialization associated with despair and ruination and a complete lack of perspectives, in particular for the young people in the area. Over to you, Holm.
Pues gracias, Stefan. La pregunta de Luisa fue sobre la relación del aumento del populismo, particularmente del populismo de derechas, con los procesos de deindustrialización. Y Stefan dice que ve una clara relación, porque en las regiones en el mundo, digamos, que han vivido un fuerte proceso de deindustrialización, pues sí, ahí han surgido fuertes movimientos de populismo ultraderecha, como en Francia, como el propio Trumpismo en Estados Unidos, y también en el Reino Unido. Y dice, y pregunta, ¿por qué en Asturias esto no ha pasado? En Asturias quizá hay más una tendencia hacia un populismo de izquierda que de derecha. Es una excepción en este sentido en el panorama europeo. Y bueno, yo en general claramente estoy de acuerdo. Hay una relación muy directa entre digamos, la vieja clase obrera, que se siente digamos, devaluada fuertemente por los procesos de deindustrialización, y también se siente abandonada por los sindicatos y partidos obreros tradicionales, que no son capaces de defenderlos ni son capaces de formular alternativas realistas frente a estas políticas de industrialización y también de construcción de memorias, digamos, desde arriba. Sobre Asturias casi prefiero que hablan otros, porque yo no veo, no estoy tan seguro, que sigue siendo una excepción. Primero, el populismo de izquierda, sí es verdad que hay, está aquí, por ejemplo, Izquierda Unida, todavía en Asturias existe, en el resto de España prácticamente ha desaparecido, y Podemos, no lo sé si va a vivir mucho tiempo en Asturias y en general en España. Así que no veo un fuerte populismo de izquierdas sostenido en Asturias y tampoco espero equivocarme, estoy tan seguro que el populismo de derecha no va a surgir también en Asturias. Pues nada más por mi parte y pues espero más intervenciones. Está José Ibarra. Adelante.
Buenas tardes. Creo que puedo hacer la intervención también en inglés. I'll try to speak in English so that Stefan and the others can understand. I think I have one reason for what's happening in Asturias, one difference between what's happening in Asturias and the rest of Spain. Because you have to know that the exception of Asturias is not only in Europe, but in Spain. All the other industrial regions of Spain that has suffered deindustrialization have developed a right-wing population. For example, my hometown in Cartagena, the right-wing, the extreme right-wing Vox is the most voted party here in Cartagena. What's the difference between all of the Spanish regions and the European regions and Asturias? In my opinion, in Asturias, there is no immigration at all. There is no immigration at all. The industrial workers of Asturias haven't been substituted by others, but in the other regions of Europe, the old workers have been substituted by immigrants. In the case of Europe, from immigrants coming from Eastern Europe, and in the Southern Europe, from immigrants coming from North Africa. It's my opinion. I'm not sure if it is true or not. La diré también en español para los demás. Creo que la diferencia importante entre Asturias y el resto de regiones es que en Asturias no tiene inmigración. Para que no haya habido, es una opinión muy discutible, pero no ha triunfado el populismo de derechas en Asturias porque allí no tienen inmigración. Es una opinión quizá muy atrevida, pero es mi opinión.
Gracias. Es un punto interesante, creo yo. I don't know, Stefan, if you want to comment something on this. But
yeah,
I think
it's a very
interesting
point that it is true that where we see right-wing populism, it is often building on a white working class, a disenfranchised white working class that is desperately trying to delineate its own fortunes from those of migrants. In most of the deindustrializing areas, we do have substantial migrant populations. So it is a very interesting point, I think, that the absence of migration in Asturias might explain also the absence of right-wing populism there. Yeah, I mean, I find it entirely convincing, although Ruben might have a different view.
Thank you.
Gracias, Stefan. ¿Hay más manos levantados? No veo.
I think Ruben wants to say something, right?
Ruben y Elina, sí. Bueno, Ruben, adelante.
Bueno, yo creo que esta idea de José tiene bastante sentido y seguramente en Asturias lo tenemos muy poco reflexionado, pero efectivamente los trabajadores asturianos vieron cómo se iban hundiendo los sectores industriales y la economía asturiana, pero no pudieron buscar un chivo expiatorio en los recién llegados o en los forasteros, porque eso no estaba pasando, ¿no? Más bien estamos viviendo como una tragedia el volver a convertirnos otra vez en una tierra de migración. aunque es una emigración muy peculiar respecto al pasado, porque nuestros inmigrantes emigran con un título universitario en su mayoría, ¿no? Yo quería plantear otra cosa que tiene que ver con algo que Holm planteaba y que quería ver si Stefan, que tiene una perspectiva comparada muy amplia, nos lo confirma. Holm hablaba de un argumento que fue muy recurrente en el caso asturiano sobre la deuda moral que existía con Asturias. Este papel de los mineros asturianos calentando y proporcionando energía al país y la industria asturiana sosteniendo a la economía nacional en los peores momentos. Son argumentos de economía moral, en realidad. No son seguramente tan originales, pero yo creo que esos mismos argumentos fueron usados frente a la reconversión minera tanto en Francia como en Gran Bretaña. Y quizá la diferencia de Asturias es que esos argumentos persistieron durante mucho más tiempo porque la reestructuración de nuestra minería fue mucho más lenta. La muerte fue muy lenta, muy gradual, muy pausada en el tiempo, mientras que la liquidación de la minería en Francia o en Gran Bretaña fue mucho más rápida. Y también, evidentemente, en el caso asturiano, el poder político y derivado de eso, el poder mediático o la influencia social del sindicalismo minero significaba una peculiaridad.
Stefan?
Yeah.
I will try to translate the question of Ruben.
Thank you.
He was referring to a point of my speech when I was talking about the idea of a moral debt that the rest of Spain has with Asturias, because Asturias had raised up the Spanish economy in very difficult times. And Ruben was asking you in a comparative perspective of this question of moral debt, because in France and in Britain there was a similar story of the coal mining regions, let's say, holding up the national economies in former times, and so this question of moral debt could come up there in similar ways, but Ruben thinks that in Spain there are two differences to these regions in France and Britain. That is, first of all, the process of deindustrialization, particularly of closing the coal pits in Asturias, was later and much slowly. And in France and in Britain, it was very, let's say, it was a rupture in a relatively short period. And also the particular strengths of the Asturian miners' unions, not only as unions, but also as a political force, also played, let's say, a role in maintaining so long time this discourse of moral debt with the rest of Spain. So what do you think about this question?
Yeah, very interesting. Absolutely. I mean, I do think that this issue of moral debt is an important one in many regions, because coal played such a big role at various points often in the nation's history. Obviously at the point of industrialization, but then also in moments of economic crisis. If I add Germany to the picture, without coal, no industrialization. Without coal and steel, no rise of Germany to preeminent economic nation in Europe before 1914. Without coal and steel, no economic recovery after the First World War, no economic recovery after the Second World War. So we do have this idea of moral debt certainly also very strongly in Germany, I think. I mean, I would argue that indeed Ruben is right in pointing to the importance of negotiated strategies for the closing of mines or industries as an important point of departure in terms of how much that moral debt can be remembered and in how far that memory then is important for specific policies. I come back to the differentiation that I tried to make in the paper between strongly neoliberal market radical systems and more corporatist systems. And I think where we do have a more negotiated settlement, we also have a greater willingness to remember also from official governmental levels the role that industry played in the history of the nation. Especially, I think another factor that comes into play here is to what extent these industrial spaces can define themselves as spaces with their own kind of identity. Because if that identity is linked to a proud position in the national past, then it is also far easier for these spaces to demand the collection of the debts. But I think this is only possible, at least in a concerted way, in corporatist systems, whereas we also have the idea of a moral debt in market radical neoliberal systems, but it is exclusively restricted to counter-hegemonic strategies from below that are, if you like, working against the complete erasure of industrial pasts from official memory that comes from governments and also often captains of industry. So I would see the main difference here perhaps not between France and Britain on the one hand and Germany and maybe Asturias on the other hand. Although, Holm, if I understood your paper correctly, you were arguing that in fact at official level there is no willingness to pay that debt. But maybe I misunderstood you there. I mean, I would like to explore further to what extent various forms of corporatism have been able to create frameworks for memory cultures of industrialization and deindustrialization that have been beneficial for heritageization, and in how far market radical systems have denied that, but in denying that, it has produced counter-hegemonic forces from below that are trying to also, through forms of industrial heritage, tell a different story to the stories that are, if you like, the official narratives of deindustrialization.
Thank you, Stefan. Pues intento resumir lo que contesta Stefan a la pregunta de Rubén sobre lo de deuda moral, que dice primero que sí es un elemento importante en muchas regiones industriales, digamos, de carbón y acero, porque en muchos países estas regiones han protagonizado los procesos de industrialización y esto ha generado esta sensación de una posible deuda moral del resto del país y de la economía con estas regiones. También en Alemania, en la cuenca del Ruhr existe esta sensación, pero él vuelve a su distinción de su charla cuando diferencia entre países de radicalismo de mercado y neoliberales y países con tradición corporatista y estrategias negociadas de gestionar los declives industriales. Y dice que en contextos corporatistas y de negociación, pues es más factible argumentar con esta deuda moral y convertir esto en un argumento político a favor de políticas, digamos, de ayuda a amortiguar los impactos de los procesos de desindustrialización, mientras en sistemas neoliberales, pues estos intentos de argumentos con la memoria y la deuda moral, pues suelen ser contestados fuertemente desde arriba. Y así, digamos, no tienen este impacto. Y Stefan me ha entendido que en España tampoco funciona este argumento, pues según mi charla, pues es un poco quizá interpretado de forma exagerada. Yo creo que ahora en Asturias pues se ha dado cuenta que este argumento ya no funciona, pero sí durante muchos años de negociación y de gestión del declive industrial en esta región, pues sí ha jugado un papel y ha ayudado también de tener un cierto orgullo frente a los gobiernos centrales. Y también por parte de los gobiernos consideran, por ejemplo, las generosas jubilaciones y otras subvenciones y planes a favor de la región como un intento de reconocer el gran pasado de Asturias en España. No sé si Rubén o alguien quiere añadir algo a este debate.
No, quizá, bueno, a lo mejor damos demasiada importancia a ese discurso pensando que tiene un efecto muy fuerte respecto a las políticas que se aplican. Yo más bien tengo la impresión de que ese discurso, desde luego en la negociación o en las políticas de concertación, es muy instrumental. Es un mensaje que cala en la población, que la gente repite y que por lo tanto es utilizado en la negociación, pero probablemente, bueno, simplemente porque es un recurso fácil, no porque eso esté pesando realmente las decisiones que finalmente se toman, que son una cuestión de correlación de fuerzas, más que nada.
Sean? Just to translate what Ruben added.
Yes, thank you.
And I agree with Ruben in this, that the discourse on moral debt was used during all these long years of negotiations and how to manage the industrial decline in Asturias in a very instrumental way, because it was very easy to transmit this moral debt discourse to the population. They understood it and shared it to a big extent. And so it played, let's say, an instrumental role in the negotiation processes, whereas the real policies adopted were much more, let's say, a result of the constellation of the power forces in these different situations during the industrial decline.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had one more from Elena, was?
Sí, yo creo que Elena había levantado.
¿Me oyen? Sí.
Elena? No. Yes, go ahead.
I'm speaking from a very peripheral place, Brazil. To ask Stefan, in a sense, aren't you generalizing too much when you, and after the examples we have listened to in these days, and after the argument of Ruben about the negotiation case, aren't you generalizing too much in saying that the global South can only reflect what is happening in the North? Don't you believe in a possible political and cultural empowerment of autonomous social movements in the South? Is a question I had to make here, because of course I hope that we will be free from the right and from the radicalism of market in a future that's not so long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lina. I think that's also a very good point. Yes, I mean, first of all, your general point, am I generalizing too much? Absolutely. I mean, it's the whole talk was at a level of extremely high generalization in an attempt to provide first orientations in what a possible global comparison of deindustrialization might look like. Now, in terms of the global South, I think that, first of all, we probably should differentiate very different trajectories of deindustrialization and also of heritageization in the global South. It sort of we had earlier a presentation about Argentina, where the presenters made it very clear that the deindustrialization was directly linked to the advent of the dictatorship in 1976 in Argentina. Similar developments, I think, took place in Chile after the dictatorship took control of the country in 1973. We all know about the work of the Chicago Boys in Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s. So this is very different, say, from those cases of post-communist forms of deindustrialization in the global South that we see, or also very different to the kind of deindustrializations that we see, say, on the Indian subcontinent. So you're entirely right. We need to be much more differentiating within those very broad ideal types of deindustrialization. When I refer to the fact, when I refer to the situation of post-colonialism in the global South and Chakrabarty's famous statements of being forever in the waiting room of history, I was referring to the fact that it is often very difficult for countries in the global South to link at least the beginnings of industrialization to a proud national past, because the beginnings of these industrializations lie in colonial regimes. And then, of course, even after political independence, it was often the case that economic interdependencies with the global North remained. I mean, even the whole process of deindustrialization in the global North and industrialization in parts of the global South was a policy that arguably was started in the economic command centers of the global North, because global capitalism could make more profit by deindustrializing parts of the global North and industrializing parts of the global South. So the power imbalances between the global North and the global South were maintained and are presumably still in place very much today. Where I think you are entirely right is in saying that it is possible for the global South to develop autonomous social movements which play an influential role in battling deindustrialization. And we have seen that, of course, we have seen that above all in Brazil with the old regime, the unions and the Workers' Party playing an influential role in trying to steer the country into a different direction. I'm thinking of all of the policies of positive discrimination, etc., that undoubtedly had problems of their own, and we can discuss that for a very long time, but a very different kind of framework, political framework, and the importance of social movements for that framework, I would stress very much. So I do think that there is room for empowerment of autonomous social movements in the global south. And where I was referring to this kind of waiting room of history, it was only in relation to what kind of memorial regimes we can attach to policies of industrialization and also policies of deindustrialization.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bueno, intentando resumir, Elina preguntó, bueno, primero cuestionó un poco las generalizaciones de hablar del sur global como solo una industrialización y desindustrialización que refleja al norte global, y preguntando después por posibilidades de empoderamiento de movimientos sociales propios autónomos en países del sur global. Stefan pues, admite que sus categorías son muy generalizaciones, muy fuertes, y quizá en algunos casos demasiado generalizados, y admite la necesidad de diferenciar quizá más, por ejemplo, de distintas formas, de distintos senderos de industrialización y desindustrialización. Y ahí hay muchas diferencias, por ejemplo, citó Argentina y Chile, donde los procesos de industrialización están muy relacionados con las dictaduras en estos países. Algo en el mundo postcomunista, y también muy diferente. Stefan?
Yeah?
Yes, I tried just well, first of all, thank you very much for your participation, for your assistance in this, in this event, which is was a little bit strange for all of us, but particularly for Ruben and Irene to organize this under these circumstances. And and so thank you for participate in this format, let's say, under these conditions.
Well, a big thank you also from me, especially to Ruben and Irene, for organizing it. And I was sort of really learning a lot during the conference, and I was especially, very pleased with the subtitling, of course, because it allowed me to follow at least a little bit most of the presentations. So I realized it was an awful lot of work, and so a big thank you for doing that. As I said, I enjoyed the presentations enormously. Learned a lot from them. But of course, it would have been much better if we could have all assembled in Asturias. And of course, what I shall miss most now after the session is to have a pint of cider, which would be great to share with you. But unfortunately, that will have to wait until another time. But it was great to be at least virtually in Asturias, and hopefully before long, it will be possible to do so again in real life.
Eso esperamos y queda pendiente.
Pues nada, Stefan, agradece también particularmente a Rubén e Irene la organización de estas excelentes dimos charlas y contribuciones, dice que ha aprendido mucho y fue muy interesante, y particularmente agradece la subtitulación que le ha permitido poder seguir, al menos de alguna manera, esas contribuciones, pero sí echa de menos que nos reunamos en persona en Asturias, y dice particularmente echa de menos después de esto de tomar un pulín de sidra con nosotros, pero esto tiene que esperar de momento.
En la plaza de Requejo deberíamos estar ahora.
Bueno, pues nada, estamos.
Luisa, ¿va a decir algo?
En la próxima encuentro vamos a comenzar con la sidra, ¿sí? Comenzando. Gracias, muchas gracias Rubén e Irene por todo.
Sí.
Fue estupendo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, everybody.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Muy bien, pues lo damos por cerrado, ¿no?
Vale, yo creo que sí, ¿no?
Sí, sí. Bueno,
Saludos a todos de Cartagena, ha sido una experiencia muy buena. Muchas gracias.
saludos a todos. A ti, José, gracias por la resistencia, porque estuviste al pie del cañón los 4 días, ¿no? Debes de haber sido un sindicalista muy duro. Negociador,
Piel de
fatigado.
rinoceronte. Los sindicalistas tenemos piel de rinoceronte y resistimos cosas que nadie imagina.
Saludos, saludos.
Muy bien, pues nada. Suerte a todo el mundo.
Suerte. Hasta luego, hasta luego.
Good luck.
Thank you very much, everyone. Hope to
Thank
see
you.
you soon. Goodbye.
Sí, ojalá. Chao.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you very much.